Good morning, everybody. We're just waiting until everybody can join us. It takes a few minutes for the registered participants to join, so thank you for your patience. So give us 1 minute. Hope everybody's doing well today. It's a gloomy day here at DataGovHub World Headquarters, i.e. our family room here in Arlington, Virginia. But hopefully the sun will come out soon. I hope all of you are doing well, and we're so glad to have you join us. We have a kitty joining us today.
We do. She's ready to give she's listened to so many presentations on the gender digital divide.
She's an expert. She's a kitty expert. I've always wanted to meet a kitty expert. My cats are not, well, they can answer the phone.
Oh, yes.
Okay, good morning. So we're going to get started. I'm Susan Aronson, and I direct the Digital Trade and Data Governance Hub. And I am really thrilled to welcome Chenai Chair from the World Wide Web Foundation and Revi Sterling from DAI and USAID. And you have the links to their bios. And so we're going to get started. And so I'm going to start with a question for Revi, but use the Web Foundation's data to ask Revi a question, which is, on average, according to the Web Foundation, more men are online and they're more likely to be online. And other organizations have reported similar gaps. Why is it so hard for women to get online? Why is the gender digital divide so big?
Well, I think there's a lot of complexity to that, but overall, if we look at the status of women worldwide, we see inequalities everywhere because empowered women are somehow this terrible threat to men, to the status quo, etc. And there's something very powerful, obviously, about the internet and the kind of information that women can receive and act upon. So you have a lot of restrictions against women's mobile use, both even at the local legal levels and policy levels to just sort of gendered social norms that talk about how good women, don't go on this immoral thing because it will somehow, corrupt them or empower them, which is somehow the same sides, two sides of the same coin. There's also other prohibiting forces at work. We know because of these unequal social norms that women have less income, fewer hours to spend on things like the internet. Their safety and privacy is a huge concern. If there's only one cyber cafe in your community and you don't feel comfortable going into it, you're not. If you only have a feature phone that has no mobile internet capabilities, a smartphone is probably way out of your reach of cost and budget. And then there's just a lot of women that I'll talk about this in this little slide deck that I do in a second, but don't feel the confidence, don't feel like they're smart enough to use the phone. I mean, they've internalized that less than psychology, and they think that the internet and technology is simply not for them, which is insane, because we know that women's advancement is the key to sustainable development, and we know that technology is this amazing force that can increase the breadth and range and scalability of development solutions. So the kind of the force multiplier of women in technology should be a no-brainer, and yet they work against each other. I do have a short presentation, Susan, if you don't mind me going into it, to kind of do some background. Cut me off if I take too long. I really want to get to Chenai and her work. All right, I'll share my screen. Let me find my presentation here. It's just a few slides. Let's see. Hopefully you'll, of course, it's on the Great. So in case, I just want to talk a little bit about some of these issues of access and participation, and then I have my contact information listed at the end. I do want to point out that on this URL, revisterling.com, is just a list of gender and digital divide resources from all of the latest reports, and we'll certainly add the web foundations to it when it comes out this summer. But has all the, for the last 5 years, has really the reports where you can track some of the research about gender digital divide and some of the programs if you're more interested. And I would love to talk at any time. I mean, really with the gender digital divide, it does seem like, that this should be, like I said, a no-brainer with this force multiplier of women in technology, but there is this gap between women and men's usage, and unfortunately, it actually is growing. And it's growing because we see this trend towards, populism around the world. We see people being reactionary about women's empowerment. And if you look at the UNDP's Human Development Report, that just, the theme for 2020 was gender inequalities. And globally, their global social norms index shows that men and women alike have a 91% bias against women's empowerment when compared to where they think, a man's role should be. And that wasn't a global South study, that was a global study. So again, even as the pace of technology increases, women are also left behind because they're not keeping up. They don't have the access to the skills and the training. Things are more expensive. So there are a lot of things that play into this growing gender digital gap. Maybe 10 or 20 years ago, this wasn't such a crisis because it was basically, oh, a woman doesn't have access to the internet. That's okay. There is no internet content in her language. It's development related, etc. But now every development sector, every development agency has a digital strategy. So in cases where you would initially have maybe a farm extension worker coming out to the villages and being able to talk to women and men, now it's all moved to maybe a smartphone application that someone has competed to produce in this kind of development is an industry economy. And now women can't access that information that they used to be able to get from the extension worker. I'm not saying this is bad, I'm just saying rip and replace has its consequences. And we keep making the same mistakes. We keep having, we keep trying to address the digital divide in this way of let's just bring technology to women and they'll use it, but this isn't Field of Dreams, and if you build it, they won't necessarily come. We really need to look at the root causes. And if you'll see, even with the quote on the bottom of my screen from the Alliance for Affordable Internet, this can be very dire in some communities. So you can get this gap of internet from the kind of global gap of 14% to 70+% in certain countries and communities. You look at some place like Mozambique, where only 10% of the entire population, and that's upper middle class and above, only 10% even have smartphones. And we're building all these development applications for poor people in Mozambique on smartphones. You can see why there's a huge design mismatch. So we really need to define this gap better, have a clearer research agenda, and that's some of the work that Chenai is doing. So very briefly, for 20 years, we seem to be doing the same things. We teach women how to use the Microsoft Office suite, but we don't have jobs for them after they graduate from a 6-week training. We don't have good security in internet security training online. So, women fall, prey to scams and all sorts of immoral content that they don't understand, that they don't have to receive that picture. They can turn off their phones. It's not going to break them, etc. We keep assuming that hackathons are going to provide a solution for a community that we're not even co-designing with. I've talked about smartphones, but where's for this woman here? This is a training we did in Bihar, India last year. Was just trying to understand what is out there on this thing called the internet that even could be helpful and have utility for this woman in her life. So really understanding the deep cultural context before we go in with a technology solution to human problems that we haven't even identified because we haven't stopped to really listen and understand what form factor is appropriate. Maybe it's not a phone at all. Maybe it's an offline, online hybrid device like Amplio's Talking Book or OuterNet solutions where you have offline content because it's too hard to actually access and pay for internet. And then, really kind of looking at kind of what does work. And this is a picture of voice-based social network that Molly Health did with their WomenConnect grant in Bamako. You've got to work with those in power. Just targeting women alone doesn't help if their husbands and mother-in-laws and religious figures and community leaders say, you can't use this phone. So really working with those in power to build those compelling cases for women to be online, and then tracking the benefit. I mean, the quotes that we're getting now from our projects in Mali, in India, in Nigeria, where husbands have said, I would never let my wife and children online, but now that they've been part of this program and they understand and I understand, I would never not begrudge them this, because it's actually helping my entire family. You know, we haven't had to pay a medical bill in 6 months because now we know when the vaccine schedules are. Very, you know, things like that that are very relevant. Because women make up the world's largest population of illiteracy and low literacy populations, and because we have billions of people on this planet that speak unwritten languages that don't have a Unicode equivalent, we've got to be more creative with voice and text-free user interfaces, and that's research that's been going on for forever. So we need to leverage more of that in R&D agenda. A typo. Creative cost structures in terms of things like rent-to-own mobile phone use and multiple devices. One device per multiple people is a common model. I would say that a lot of things have to do with this confidence piece, this building up confidence to even use technology. So we've been working with Viamo in Tanzania to have this IVR program that basically explains what is the internet, what is a social network, why would I use Facebook versus WhatsApp, how do I search, what's a good search query, what if I get harassed? So getting your questions answered far beyond for the first time you actually venture online. And then there are a whole lot of interesting technologies that are emerging. I think we think of technology for development somehow as the hand-me-down technology and the cell phone and laptop drive. But when you're doing computing at the margins, it really pushes the margins of computer science and the things we need to do with power consumption, with these intuitive interfaces, with emerging AI opportunities. And then I'll close on this one with the idea that technology can actually help create new social norms. With AFCHICS, we've been working on creating community networks, local ISPs that are completely women-run and organized. And so they're the providers of this important utility. And there is no gendered pushback because of that, because otherwise the alternative is no internet. And then these are just sort of the guiding questions that when we're looking at gender and digital divide projects, either your own or the ones that I've been working on or the ones I consult on, is under what conditions in this community can women use ICT and digital development, applications, platforms, et cetera, and then finding that one condition or those limited conditions and really working within them, and then showing that this is a benefit, showing that women are still safe and okay. They're not endangering their family or themselves by being online, because we've trained them to understand what is out there. Who is saying no into women's community technology use, and how do we work with that? These compelling use cases, and then really celebrating the men and the people in power that are letting women use technology. And then, the biggest question is, we just keep, this is not a technology issue, right? This is a very human one. We keep marginalizing gender in all aspects of development. We call it now, it's not so much the gender digital divide, we talk about digital inclusion, and that's a lovely term, except it obfuscates gender, and that's the biggest missing population in digital development. So again, with that eye on social norms, with redefining our research and development agenda, I think we really do have an opportunity to make some huge differences here. So I welcome you to look at my little site there that has some resources, to email me at any time so we can get closer to achieving SDG 5B, which is the promotion of empowerment of women through technology. It's important that they're in that order. And I'd love to work together in any capacity that we can. Thank you, Ms. Susan. I'll stop sharing.
Thank you so much. That was great. Okay, well, Chenai, we already have a question. I do want to say this. Some participants are sending me emails about links, and that the link, but I hope everyone was able to attend. Let me also remind you that you can send in your questions using the Q&A at the bottom of the screen. Okay, so we have some slides here from Chenai, who's going to speak now. Can you see the slides?
Susan, we're not seeing them yet.
That's just weird. Okay. I don't know why that is, but do you want to start talking?
Now, it looks like Thomas is putting them on.
Okay,
Yep.
there you go.
Perfect.
Sorry.
Can I go ahead?
Yes, please.
Sure. Thank you so much, Susan and Revi. I think, first of all, I've been on so many Zooms and webinars, and what I realized will become my opening line is that every time you talk about technology and the challenges associated, actually accessing and using these platforms are a clear example. Every time I try to log onto a Zoom, either I do not have electricity access or my network completely shuts down. And so these are already some of the challenges that people face, in particular women, in trying to access the internet. So in response and adding on to actually what has already been said by Revi when it comes to the challenges that women face when it comes to internet access, Web Foundation has always conducted research as one of its policy advocacy areas is around ensuring a web for all, a safe and secure web. And one of those areas has been around closing the gender digital divide. We conducted research in 2019 in Colombia, Ghana, Indonesia, and Uganda. And this is just a snippet into the report that will actually be released in July and adds on into our 2015 flagship report on understanding the gender digital divide. So the challenges we found, and next slide, please. So the challenges we found that have always been focused on has been the quality of access. In this instance, what we've launched quite recently, actually yesterday, the meaningful connectivity measure, we actually realized that there is a gender gap in terms of the quality of access that one has. It's not enough to simply have access to the technology, but it's about the type of device. So we've been looking at it in terms of 4 measures, which would be having a smart device, having an unlimited connection, having a 4G mobile connection, and also being able to use internet daily. And what we found is that there's actually a gendered gap when it comes to meaningful connectivity, which we focus on in terms of quality of access. And in countries that have had seemingly the gendered access divide closing, we actually find a great gendered gap in terms of meaningful connectivity. The challenges in terms of meaningful connectivity have been pointed out, have more to do with digital skills, affordability of the network itself and the device, as well as time limitation. I think what has really been interesting and what has been highlighted, especially in this health pandemic, is who actually has the responsibility when it comes to taking care of the household between men and women, and how oftentimes that reproductive labor goes unnoticed as you've doubled up your workload of having to work from home and having to take care of your family, and not every household is equal in division of labor. Another aspect that we found that is an issue when it comes to women being able to access and make use of the web is more to do with misinformation. And the issue around misinformation is actually quite important right now, given the criminalization of people who've been peddling fake news or sharing misinformation, and even social media networks platforms responding by taking down content. This issue raises the challenge around that women are less likely to actually verify the information that they find online. Yet they are deterred from using the internet once they have access to it because of misinformation. In our focus group studies, we actually had recommendations from women that they don't know if this information is valid, and they usually check for local news, so your traditional media sites, to see if the information that they found on WhatsApp or on other social media platforms is actually true. And then another issue which I think really speaks into safety online, increased online harassment, as the recent UN Women publication on online gender-based violence actually points out, that women are much more concerned about the safety. And in terms of this, I'm talking about women from a perspective of race, sexuality, and also socioeconomic status. So that intersectionality of the experience means that women are more concerned with privacy, and the higher level of education or access to a smartphone, the more aware you are of your privacy concerns online. And they're more concerned with issues around their personal messages, health data, or family-related information, because of the concerns that once this information is breached, there could be a potential physical and online harm. We find instances of women actually pointing out that once they shared a particular image that was disregarded in society, they would get actual physical rape threats, or someone continuously harassing them, demanding sexual attention. And just to close this off, my first round of interventions is a quote that we had from a rural participant, that when it comes to being aware of privacy, but having limitations to actually exercise its rights, you find that sometimes it's more an issue of not understanding when we talk about informed consent, and then this moves us into privacy and data protection. It's that sometimes there's a need to access a service, and the terms of service that you're being told that then informs informed consent are actually not sufficient, or one does not understand them, or they are more tedious and are visualized in a way that makes it much more difficult for people to read. You then find that, as this code points out, sometimes you just have to, you accept it, you go ahead, because you need to find what you want. And sometimes you proceed and you get confused when you continue. So these are some of the issues that we found when it comes to women actually being able to use the internet and the challenges that they face. At the end of the slide, it's basically my contact and keeping in touch, and you can sign up to the Web Foundation mailer, so that when the actual report comes out in July, you can have first access to it. But we can keep in touch because we've got more work coming up to really explore online gender-based violence. Thanks, Susan.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. Okay, so we're going to open the floor up to questions. So we'll start with the first one. Okay, so the first question is, it's not really a question. It's a statement. Men do not let women use technology. They stop blocking it.
Well, I mean, I think I'll just jump in on
please.
that one because it's germane to, you know, to my research and our findings, which is, yes, absolutely. Men are a lot of the blocking forces, as are mother-in-laws and employers and parents and religious leaders. And that's why we really, really have to work with them to understand, is in any capability, in any possible world, would they let women use technology? And even when they say no, you know, we have found a place where, well, could they look at prayer times? Could they at least get a vaccine schedule? Could you look at that with them online? Could you let them, you know, look at you looking up this information? And you start with these tiny, tiny, tiny avenues in, which is the only way in a lot of communities to make any headway at all. And it is painstaking and it is slow, but it is the sustainable way of doing something. So, you know, men really, you know, care about the health of their unborn children or their born children. So sitting down with their wife and saying, okay, let's go to this website together, or look at this text message about where to get free antenatal care, is something that usually we can involve men's interest in. And once they see that it is not a scam, that it is perhaps a site that is condoned by their cleric or their doctor or their mother, you know, then maybe the woman can go back and check that site periodically for more information. So literally we take granular steps working in communities where there is just absolutely no capability right now of women online. I have actually never worked in a community in 25 years where we haven't been able to find at least one tiny compelling use case for people that otherwise blocked women's technology use.
Chenai, can you add to that?
Yeah, I think I mean, there is that main aspect, but then when you take the power dynamics as well, and when you think about younger people trying to access the internet, it really comes on from parents or older people in the community, and just getting onto that use case aspect. I think it's about demystifying the internet for older people within community. There has been some research that was done that specifically looked at the shift in power dynamics when young people were able to use the smartphone and the devices, but they were owned by older family members. And what it showed was the need to create more for conversation in terms of a younger person would be able to access the device or be able to use it much more easier than the actual person the device was bought for. And in that context, what it resulted in was highlighting the skills exchange between older people and younger people as a use case example. And also demystifying the aspect that young people mainly go on the internet to access pornographic content. And I think that actually resulted in more, as the example that Revi has pointed out around showing that, you know, you can find particular information. This is a similar issue of breaking down the power dynamics that existed by actually showing the value that it has. But it's not always the case. In some instances where then even when those power dynamics are broken down, there are still other social and cultural nuances that we have to focus on breaking down in terms of increasing internet use for women.
Thank you for your answers. Just building on that, do you think, I mean, having a law on the books doesn't mean the law is enforced, but would that be helpful, having a right to access the internet, given that so much government information and access to education is online, or that's just not important enough? Chenai?
Yeah, so I actually think that raises the question of awareness of rights. And that's a compendium of questions that we actually do have in our study that we've done, where we focused on, are people actually aware of their internet rights and their digital rights that they have? And taking it one step back, are you aware of your human rights? And while it is important in terms of policy advocacy as well as funding initiatives, I think it's multi-layered in terms of the response that it has by having it as a right to access the internet. And it does come down to that ability for then civil society to advocate for this right to be recognized. Even though it's written down in most broadband policy plans, the work then comes into focusing it and finding business cases for people to actually sponsor the implementation of people then having rights to internet access and finding alternative means to connect to the internet beyond the traditional monopoly structures that exist, maybe, for example, with mobile network operators that may be reluctant to connect to rural areas, which are often the last mile connectivity issues.
Thank you. Revi? Do you want to add?
We absolutely have to have the laws and the policies on the books so that we can have something that could be enforceable, and also so that, you know, there are international standards and metrics where countries can assess their digital readiness, the size of their gender digital divide. So having people in these ministries of ICT, in ministries of women's empowerment that actually really believe this, you know, then they have the platform to be able to go actually count the issue and have the quantitative data behind the qualitative data to actually you know, do some really interesting programs. And I think this goes to, I mean, there's someone named Stacey Alvarez had a good question about working directly with women in technology rather than through men to get to women. And this is another case where also this ties in, because if you tell a woman in a rural area who doesn't think she can access, that her compatriots in other parts of the country can do this, and you show them examples of women actually using technology and still being married and still being, you know, still being considered a good woman in terms of the community definition, then you see that, oh my goodness, you're on the wrong side of kind of the conventional wisdom in your community, and there are opportunities because these women are doing it. So we need role models, we need interventions from the policy to the grassroots, and we need to work with potential users directly, current female users to show the pathways onto the internet, into the mobile, into digital development writ large, and then we need, you know, the larger approval often of people in the communities.
So building on what Chenai said, this question is, would having terms of service translated into plain English or whatever language is the native language help, according to your experience?
Yeah, absolutely. So for some of the work that we found, it was really helpful to have the terms of service translated into local language. But in addition to translation to local language, there was more of a request of visualization, for example, or at least some of the text is quite, and I think this is often an issue that comes along in terms of just the way in which the text is set up in terms of size and how it's very small, or when you open it up. There's a good example of a administration app that was created. I think it's called Yuki, and one of their focuses is on privacy and data protection. And in their terms of service, they actually have a visualization of the key aspects around privacy issues in terms of third-party sharing of data, having a password to protect your data, and they've designed it in a way to actually address visualization so that you can understand what some of these issues are when you talk about them, so that you're not as surprised when you see some technical legal language that allows for you to meet the law in place if you have a GDPR or a Protection of Personal Information Act. So you meet the legal requirement, but you're not communicating to your customers so that when you're assessed, you pass through the privacy aspect. So it is very crucial to have it in local language that people actually do understand, and working with different communities. And it's also important to think about more visually creative ways of communicating terms of service, which for some smaller app developers who care about the communities that they're serving, they do this. Whereas for others, it's more about meeting legal requirements and therefore having the correct legal language. It seems to be a hard case for advocacy.
Thank you. Revi, do you want to add?
No, I think Chenai did a fabulous job.
She does. Have you looked at the barriers that keep women from entering STEM career fields?
Well, absolutely. In fact, that was sort of the beginning. I've been doing this for about 25 years, and the first part of my research was dedicated specifically to the barriers to STEM and the attraction, promotion, and retention of women and girls in STEM fields. And I have to say that, you know, that it's a bit of a different population. I think, you know, Chenai and I are mostly talking, you know, today about women in the lower socioeconomic strata who are facing difficulties getting online or finding avenues for meaningful participation. But absolutely, you know, STEM has been well researched and focused, and I think from a domestic standpoint, National Center for Women in IT probably has the best research corpus, but internationally, organizations like A4AI, the Anita Borg Institute, others have done some incredible work. Lots of work done in India around STEM promotion. So I would be happy to take that question offline if someone would like to communicate directly with me. I'm sure Chenai has other resources.
Chenai, do you want to add?
Yeah, so I think there was the International Girls in ICT event quite recently. I think it was February, early March. And it's quite interesting when you have conversations with women in STEM in terms of like the barriers that they do face. And some of the issues that are spoken about are more kind of like within which the environment these STEM programs are designed. So you do have women who either, you know, the preference to actually fund women to enter into these STEM programs, but issues around mentorship, to actually see someone who looks like you being part of this program was actually cited as one of the key strategies to ensure girls into ICT. And then also providing examples where it's sort of championing women in STEM to actually provide solutions for the issues that they face, rather than designing something that's going to be rather broad or has a business case and then someone can fund it. So I think quite recently, Web Foundation does support the Equals ITU skills building, and there is a report that's going to come soon out of that. But there is conversations around how do we encourage women into STEM, and that they actually do stay in STEM by addressing issues around mentorship, issues around the kind of environments that they do enter, and issues around championing the solutions that they do take on to build technology around, rather than moving them down an avenue where it seems as if it's more lucrative from a profit perspective.
Okay, thank you so much. So here's an idea. How about working with women who have access and getting them to spread the message about how this access has improved their lives? Revi, do you want to start?
Absolutely, and I was trying to weave that into my last thing, but absolutely, and Chenai has touched on it as well. You know, me coming to a community and saying, "Hey, look, my life is better because of the internet," and I'm actually not always sure that it is, isn't a terribly compelling case, given just the intersectionality and power relations of me in a community. But having somebody that is a cousin to someone that has left a village and come back, or has recently developed a new skill and now is using it in the service of their own aspirations, is probably the best role model. Absolutely.
Chenai, do you want to add?
Yeah, so in our focus group studies, when we asked how ready were you to make use of the internet and how did you pick up the skills to make use of the internet, what we found from all of the respondents, including men and women in the focus group discussions, although we had more women, was that peer-to-peer learning was so important, that they actually picked up their ability to use the internet by asking people around them, the women around them, to show them how to use the internet. And for those with advanced internet skills, actually making use of YouTube channels and seeing who's actually doing what on YouTube. So that kind of non-traditional learning for women who've accessed the internet without necessarily being in schools that then teach you the necessary digital or computer skills is really important. And I mean, that's what has been the response within our studies.
Thank you. Can you expand on some of the variations in gender gaps across countries? What you found in your research, Chenai?
Yep. So on the meaningful connectivity gap, what we actually found was when it came to basic internet use in Colombia, it was 0.99%, so just under 1%. But when it came to meaningful connectivity, it was rounded up to actually 17%. And then in Ghana, it was an internet use gap of, so by internet use, we were basically looking at like, do you use the internet or social media? It was about 6%. And then when it came to meaningful connectivity, it was actually 14% of a meaningful connectivity gap. And then in Indonesia, it was actually less than 0% when it came to basic internet use. And then at the meaningful connectivity gap, it was about 3%. So those are the gaps that we've found in terms of internet use and connectivity.
Okay, so Revi, this is a question for you. In the face of those differences, can you share examples for the challenge to tackle those variations you see now?
Sure, and I saw that in advance, so I am going to just pop up this little screen. Hopefully you can see it. These are some of the projects that we've been working on with the WomenConnect Challenge, which is very focused on working with local community-based organizations to address the social norms that continue to keep women offline and if not offline, underconnected and underempowered. So it's been a range of projects, 13 projects across 9 different countries. And really it's worked from things that were very focused on the technology, such as using AI and machine learning to tie women's voice to their cell phones so that no one else could use it, and thus try to alleviate the 30% disappearance rate of smartphones amongst women, to things like I discussed with the community network, where women are actually bringing and supporting this vital activity in the communities, these text-free user interfaces that Chenai has been talking about as well, where if you have low literacy or if you're illiterate, and quite frankly, it is more interesting to watch a video about an end user license agreement, or term of service if it's a small TikTok video or something along those lines than to read through page of page. So any sort of graphical representation that's more accessible, these are the types of programs leading with community problems and using technology as a way of communicating them. So with humanitarian open street maps, we've been working in Peru to track instances where people are actually reporting gender-based violence in unsafe spaces, to Mugumu, Tanzania, the same project with a different focus, which was making sure that girls that were going to be subjected to FGM were actually rescued by a safe house prior to cutting, and then they were reintegrated back into their family, etc. So we've done a lot with different forms of working with social norms that affect technology, and then conversely, how technology can actually affect the social norms in this sort of Mobius strip intervention that we think is more of a thoughtful, comprehensive way to address gender digital divide gaps in a much more sustainable and community appropriate way. And I'll stop sharing the screen now, but I could talk about this for hours, so I won't.
Do either of you work directly with teenage girls to build bigger internet user bases? Chenai?
No, so I can say that I don't work directly, but there is more kind of support with people who do work directly with these communities in terms of talking about issues around digital safety, issues around access, and basically your digital hygiene online. So supporting digital rights initiatives within these communities.
I agree with that. Unfortunately, I'm in the same position as Chenai. The WomenConnect Challenge is part of the WGDP initiative at USAID. It's a US-wide initiative, but it only targets adult women. At the same time, because you're dealing with such a much more vulnerable and complex population, I would say organizations, UNICEF, the work that Alex Tyers has done in this world, work that CARE and SAVE have both done. There's a lot more focus on youth at that level, primarily with UNICEF. I would definitely point people to that work, and I'm happy to connect anybody to organizations in a specific country working specifically on girls. They're just not part of my immediate network. I mean, there's different specializations, and there's people like Rhonda and Alex and others that focus specifically on girls, and they'd be better. Let's do another webinar.
Well, let's talk about that. But
Okay.
There's a couple of other really interesting questions that we need to get to first. And so one relates to discrimination and violence and intimidation of women online, which we see globally. Do you want to talk about the chilling effect it can have on women's participation in online civic space? For example, in crowdsourcing, in my field, when I look at that, I see very few women. What's up?
Chenai is more of an expert on this than I am, but I'm going to just say from my perspective, this has had a chilling effect on gender digital divide funding and initiatives writ large. I understand that online GBV is huge. It's debilitating. People die. Honor killings are performed because a woman acted out of line or was shamed, or her character was assassinated online, even if she had nothing to do with it. So this is a huge and dramatic issue, and I'm really fabulous. I'm very excited that it's getting a lot of attention from all of the large development agencies, from Amnesty, from other organizations that are really focused in on human rights. That said, my caveat to this is that I have seen some amazing gender gap work be turned down and rejected to go into the implementation phase because there was a threat that by bringing especially young women and young adult women online, that they would be so threatened online that it's better to keep them off than to actually engage with them in a safe, effective way. And I've seen some amazing proposals absolutely cut off at the knees because it was too threatening to have women online, when in fact we face offline GBV all of the time, and women around the world have learned to negotiate and mitigate and manage that, maybe not effectively, obviously, because it still exists, but even online, there's more examples of things we can do at the policy level, at the software level, at the hardware level, at the user level, to really train people around cyber hygiene and saying no, and having more. This is where the AI and the R&D can really come into play and be much more effective in blocking these things before they even happen. But I do think it's a shame that a lot of good gender digital divide work is actually not being funded because of the focus that there might be harassment of young women online. So with that sort of counter effect, let me turn it to Chenai.
Thanks, Revi. I mean, that's really quite interesting, where in some instances there's actually a push to try to get funding to build up on this evidence case of like it's happening and how do we deal with it. And I mean, the biggest example is the gender-based violence response in COVID-19 policies, and we've now had to go like, but what about online gender-based violence? Can you know, that's also part of the issue. But then in terms of the chilling effect that has been raised, it's really quite clear from our research as well that women, unless we specifically looked at content generation, like putting out videos, commenting on social and political economic issues, or even simply engaging on particular topics. And what we found was that women were more reluctant to post and participate on these platforms because of the fear of the retaliation that they could get. And when we asked who's likely to be more vulnerable online, it was specifically women and younger people. I mean, the terms that were used were children. So we found that the chilling effect is actually that there's a level of self-censorship by women and gender diverse people, with the fear of being identified on these public platforms without support if you do get harassed online. There's also a tendency then to actually leave these platforms because, and I mean in particular, social media platforms such as Twitter or even WhatsApp, having to constantly change numbers because of fear of being constantly harassed or attacked by someone and not knowing where to go. So it's that self-censorship, leaving the platform and doing less and less as you can to not be seen. And the other challenge really is that just being a woman online, just being present and just identifying as a woman or identifying as someone who's gender diverse already raises up the issues of being targeted online. And I found this example quite interesting. I've had a conversation with my colleague where he pointed out the example of when a woman is walking down the street, she's consciously aware of being catcalled or sexually harassed, or she's more conscious around her safety and plans her exit strategy. It's becoming the same thing online. The moment you post something, you're curating it to avoid being targeted. Or we have an example of one of our participants where they only posted if they had traveled days later or months later because of the fear that it might draw attention or they might get some form of retaliation. In another instance, we had an example of a woman before she was married. So the control around like who is able to speak based on who they are. They constantly got unsolicited proposals or sexual content. And then when they got married, that seemed to stop. And they were now more able to engage online. So then playing into the societal norms of who is acceptable on these platforms then results in you being able to participate. But then you can only participate in a particular context. And I'll give you the example of young female politicians who are not married. Every time there is a political discussion, it always comes back, well, in particular my Zimbabwean context, whenever there's a conversation that happens, it always comes back to harassment of, you don't have a husband, you don't have a child. If I were you, I would keep quiet so that you'd be able to do things. But there's no discussion of that political merit. So then you find that chilling effect really stems from who is able to engage, who is deemed a woman enough by societal standards. So those are some of the issues that we found that then come up into the patriarchal cultural nuances that we have to deal with.
No, I think Chenai, Chenai brings up amazing examples, and I'll just bring up another piece of the technology and gender is that with gender roles that are manifest in real life, of course they push themselves to the online platform as well. And what we have found in other projects, especially one in Southwest Morocco, was that we couldn't make headway in a digital development project because unmarried women and unrelated men would have to communicate on this online platform. And that was so unacceptable to both of them because they understood that literally the risk to their lives and safety and reputation if they did so, that what it required was software that masked their identity and turns them into a number or an animal avatar, things like that, where you actually degendered their footprint online. And certainly there could be a lot, we could have, a feminist ethics conversation about, the need to do that, sort of the wearing of the proverbial fake, wedding ring when you go into the field to protect yourself, that kind of, do you have to mask yourself to be effective? At the same time, it's interesting to know that technology does give us that affordance to sort of almost go beyond gender if we need to in certain situations to actually get a big thing done, like this large natural resource management project. It wouldn't get off the ground unless we sort of degendered the work. So, it's really an interesting, complicated situation.
Can you talk about the special needs of women with disabilities? Chenai?
Yeah, so they actually, first of all, there is to point out the caveat with research that oftentimes there is quite criticism around gender research in terms of its focus around the binary and also not taking into account people with disabilities. But specifically in response to that response, there has been work that has been done to actually raise issues around accessibility. So moving the conversation of access and then to actually talking about accessibility in terms of the design of devices and in terms of actually the content in the context. And I think that also then speaks into the issues around terms of service in the way in which it's such fine print. And if you are unable to read or have a reading disability, it's quite difficult to actually understand that. So some of the policy advocacy work that has been done by digital rights community, and I'll give you an example of an organization called CEPESA, focused out in East and Southern Africa, a policy institution. They've been really focusing on advocating around disability policy within the digital space, and they've done a lot of work in trying to raise more conscientization of governments to broaden their policy interventions when it comes to digital access and use of the internet, and to actually think designing for everyone within the community and to also be inclusive of the disabled community rather than designing with everyone has a particular level of understanding and then it becomes an add-on to these issues. So that's also another intersectional aspect to understand when it comes to the gender digital divide around race, disability, sexuality, as well as socioeconomic factors.
And I would say in terms of women and disabilities, I had my slide that had a list of questions that I believe we need to ask every time we engage with a community and a digital project is a question I left off, which is who isn't coming to your trainings, to your focus groups? And by finding out who isn't coming, those are the most, obviously usually the most marginalized and thus, disabled populations in our community, however that disability manifests itself. And it's important to make sure that if they're not at our training, we go to them because we must get that user, we must get their perspective into the design process. And working with those specific special needs usually creates a better user experience for all users. And because it becomes a better voice-based or visual medium, et cetera, that is easier to communicate to everybody at large. The other thing that I have found is that by working specifically with perhaps I'll use a case of physically disabled women in women with physical disabilities in communities, is that they're the least likely to leave their community. There's a lot of migration, obviously, between rural and urban and rural, and you're chasing where the money is and you're chasing the opportunities, and people with disabilities rarely have those opportunities, so they become stalwarts in the community. They're there, they're always there. And what I have found is that by bringing them into the management of a digital development project, into the management of a community network, they have the they have sort of the institutional knowledge in these communities, and they have the staying power, quite literally, because they are going to stay there to not lead to the brain drain. I mean, so many cases will train people in communities on certain community technologies, and then they go, oh, well, if I can do this in Matito Onday, Kenya, I can go make money in Nairobi doing this. I'm going to go become a big DJ as opposed to a community radio manager. So if you're working with people that might be constrained by a disability, they might be able to have a much longer term as the community radio manager, as the information lead in a community. And in a way, you're using them to change the social norms of gender, disability, ability, and technology in communities.
Okay, we have time for one more question, which is basically, how can we bring men into solving this problem? What role can men do to help? How do we get men to lower their opposition to letting women use technology? Chenai, do you have any thoughts?
I think Revi had some great examples of how they've worked with this in terms of the power dynamics. I'll pass it on to her.
Eek. Okay, yeah, I love this topic because obviously this is such a trigger point in so many communities. And so finding out exactly what men, exactly the reasons why they don't want the women in their lives online, and then really on helping them understand, is that the case? Do you really think when you tell me that it's infidelity, what if we turned on location tracking and you saw that when your wife goes to get water, she literally only goes to get water, and you're tired of notifications that that's all she's doing, so she's probably not having an affair. I mean, we can always counter fear with good data. If that doesn't work, some of the ways of engaging men are to celebrate the ones that are advocates for women's empowerment and somehow aren't losing some of their masculinity as part of that. There have been great applications and services outside of the gender and digital divide space. I think of something like Digital Green, where it's sort of like an American Idol with farmers. You get online, you talk about great farming practices, and you're sort of famous for your 15 minutes, right? People are like, oh, I saw you there, and you showed me that if I added a fish to my maize crop, it would get the right nutrients, and I did that, and it's better. You get kind of a reputation. So we've had men featured in community radio broadcasts, on short podcasts, etc., when they've done something that has really advocated for women, and they've gotten attention for being good men. And then we'll have other men say, well, I want to be on the radio. What do I need to do? And you talk about women's empowerment. You find these areas that really appeal to the human need for recognition and for being a good person. I mean, we're all basically, I think, golden retrievers. We all want a pat on the head. And I think that I'm not trying to be reductionist, but in a lot of ways, this is a way of doing that, which is you've got to create that win-win with men in a certain cultural context so that they allow for women's empowerment, see a benefit to it, get recognized for being, good men in the process, and then that starts kind of a cascading effect. I mean, that's where the cognitive behavioral therapy comes in, which is sort of, acting your way to a new way of thinking rather than thinking your way into a new way of acting. And we've seen that is the strategy, because development is ultimately a psychological exercise, and it's really getting into the human psyche to understand where the threats are, what the perceived threats are, and how we make this better for everybody.
Okay, well, it's 12 o'clock, so I would just want to take this opportunity to thank our speakers for taking so much time to chat with us.
Thank you, Susan, for moderating this. This has been fabulous.
Yeah, it really was. I learned a lot. And if you don't mind, I'm going to also thank our co-sponsors, the World Wide Web Foundation, the Institute for International Science and Technology at GW, ISOC-TC, the Institute for International Economic Policy at GW, and among others. And I want to also thank my colleagues, James and Thomas, for helping to organize this. And finally, we've got two really exciting ones coming up. I hope you can join us for a talk on AI principles. And the G7 is set to announce some AI principles this week, I think today. And the OECD has announced AI principles. So we're going to have competing principles, despite the fact that they have shared membership there. And then we have a talk with Denmark's tech ambassador. So thank you so much for taking the time to learn from Chenai and Revi, and have a great day, everybody. Bye.
Stay safe.
Thank you so much. Okay.